$50 and $200 can both buy you a pantry. One of them just buys you a much better month. I actually built both, a bare $50 version and a fuller $200 version, and went through them side by side to find out exactly where that extra $150 goes and whether it's actually worth it. This isn't about the $50 pantry being bad. In our $100 pantry video, we proved you can hit real calories on a tight budget. This video is the next question. Once you have a little more room, what should the extra money actually buy? Not more of the same rice. Something specific changes at each price point, and most people spend the extra money in the wrong order. We're counting down 10 categories where the two budgets genuinely diverge, from the smallest difference to the one upgrade that matters more than everything else combined. For each one, what $50 gets you, what $200 gets you, and whether that gap is worth paying for. Quick ground rules. Both pantries are built around the same core goal: real calories for real weeks, not decoration. The $50 version is lean, but genuinely functional. We're not stacking the deck by making it bad on purpose. The question is purely, what does the next $150 buy, category by category? Let's get into it. At $50, the grain is a single 20-pound bag of plain white rice. And that's a completely correct call. Rice is the cheapest real calories in the entire store, and a bag that size alone covers a huge share of a month's energy needs for a few dollars a week. At $200, the grain budget doesn't just mean more rice, it means a second and third grain. Some rolled oats for breakfast instead of every meal being rice-based, and maybe a bag of pasta or a smaller bag of a more expensive grain like quinoa for the nutritional variety and a different texture. Here's the honest verdict on this one. The calorie difference between the two setups is almost nothing. A pound of oats and a pound of rice deliver nearly identical energy. What you're actually buying with the extra money here isn't more food. It's not eating the exact same rice dish for 30 straight days, which matters more for morale than most people admit. If you're stretching a tight budget the furthest possible, staying at one grain is genuinely fine. The calories are identical. But if variety is what makes you actually finish a stockpile month without breaking down and ordering takeout, this is a cheap and low-priority place to add it back in. There's also a cheap trick that closes most of this gap without buying a second grain at all. The same bag of rice cooked 3 different ways: plain, fried with whatever vegetables are on hand, or simmered into a thicker porridge, reads as 3 different meals even though it's one ingredient. Presentation and preparation do a surprising amount of the variety work that people assume only extra grains can do. And pairing the single grain with whatever protein and seasoning budget you do changes the experience more than a second grain would anyway. Plain rice with seasoned beans and a fried egg feels like a completely different meal from plain rice with canned tuna, even though the rice itself never changed. The grain is rarely the thing making a meal repetitive. What's on top of it usually is. $50 buys the absolute basics: canned corn, canned peas, canned green beans, whatever the store brand is cheapest that week, usually 2 or 3 varieties total, chosen purely on price per can. $200 buys the same basics plus real variety: canned tomatoes for cooking sauces, mixed vegetables, maybe some canned mushrooms or artichokes, 6 or 7 different vegetables instead of 2 or 3, still all shelf-stable, still all cheap individually. The nutritional gap here is smaller than people assume. Canned vegetables retain most of their nutrients regardless of which vegetable it is, so 2 cans of corn isn't nutritionally much worse than 1 corn and 1 green bean. The real difference is what you can actually cook. 2 vegetables limits you to maybe 3 different meals on repeat. 6 vegetables opens up real meal variety. This is a genuinely good place to spend extra money if you have it, because canned vegetables are cheap individually. The jump from 2 varieties to 6 might only cost $8 or $10 extra total for a meaningfully less repetitive month. Worth a quick note if freezer space exists alongside the pantry. Frozen vegetables are usually even cheaper per pound than canned and arguably taste closer to fresh. So, a genuinely optimized version of the $200 budget might split the vegetable money between a few canned staples for true shelf stability and a couple of frozen bags for the ones you'll actually cook this week. The other underrated move at the higher budget is buying vegetables that combine well into one-pot meals. A can of tomatoes, a can of mixed vegetables, and some beans turn into a real soup in 15 minutes, which does more for morale than the same 3 vegetables eaten separately ever would. At $50, protein means canned beans and the cheapest can tuna or chicken the store carries. Functional, cheap, and it does the job of keeping you fed, but it's the same 2 or 3 proteins in constant rotation. At $200, protein gets real range. More canned meat, canned salmon instead of just tuna, peanut butter as a backup protein source, and enough volume that you're not rationing single cans across multiple meals. This is where the extra money starts matching nutritionally, not just for variety. Protein is one of the categories where quantity genuinely matters. Undereating protein for a full month has real effects on energy and muscle, in a way undereating vegetable variety doesn't. The $50 Pantry's protein total is adequate but tight. The $200 version has real buffer. If you're prioritizing where extra money goes and can only upgrade a couple of categories, protein is one of the ones that actually changes the nutritional outcome, not just the boredom level, worth ranking above pure variety upgrades like the grain category. Powdered eggs deserve a specific mention at the higher budget, since they're an underused protein upgrade. A few dollars of powdered egg reconstitutes into scrambled eggs for baking or breakfast and stores for years, which the $50 Pantry almost never has room for, but genuinely changes what a week of meals looks like. And on the cheap end, dried lentils and beans deserve credit as one of the best protein values at either budget. They're barely more expensive than canned versions pound for pound, cooked down to more servings, and the $50 Pantry can usually afford a bag of dried lentils even when it can't afford much canned meat, which softens the protein gap more than it first appears. $50 gets 1 bottle of the cheapest vegetable or canola oil available, functional for cooking, but as we've covered before, it's also the shortest clock item in the whole pantry, good for maybe a year before it starts turning. $200 allows for a smarter fat lineup. The same everyday vegetable oil for regular cooking, plus a jar of coconut oil or ghee specifically because those hold up 2 to 3 times longer. A genuinely useful hedge if this pantry is meant to last a while, not get used up in a month. The taste and cooking difference between the two setups is honestly minor. Oil is oil for most frying and sautéing. The real upgrade here is shelf life insurance, not flavor. If your pantry timeline is short, the extra oil variety barely matters. If it's meant to sit for a year or more, it's one of the better uses of extra money on this whole list. Worth remembering, fat is also the densest calorie source you can store, gram for gram beating every other category on this list. A little extra budget spent here buys real energy density, not just longevity. A free trick that stretches either budget's oil further. Keep it out of direct light, since light speeds up the same oxidation that heat does. A cheap bottle in a dark cupboard outlasts an identical bottle left on a sunny counter by months, which matters more at $50, where there's no backup oil to fall back on if the only bottle turns early. There's also a genuinely free fat source that costs nothing extra at either budget, saving rendered fat from any meat that does get cooked, strained into a jar. It's a habit more than a purchase, but it quietly adds real cooking fat to the $50 pantry without touching the grocery total at all. At $50, seasoning is salt, pepper, and maybe 1 bouillon cube pack. The bare minimum to make food edible rather than bland. And honestly, it's the single most underfunded category in almost every budget pantry. At $200, a real spice rack becomes possible. Garlic powder, onion powder, paprika, dried herbs, maybe a hot sauce or 2, 6 or 8 seasonings instead of 2. This might be the single highest impact dollar-for-dollar upgrade on the entire list, and it's consistently the one people skip. Spices cost almost nothing. A full rack might run $15 or $20 total. But they're the difference between eating the same bland rice and beans every day and eating meals that actually taste different from each other, which circles back to the single biggest reason people abandon a food stockpile. They can't stand eating it. If you're deciding where the first 20 extra dollars goes, out of every category on this list, put here first. It's the cheapest fix for the problem that actually breaks stockpiles in the real world. Acidic condiments deserve their own mention here, since they punch above their price. A bottle of vinegar or hot sauce costs almost nothing, lasts indefinitely unopened, and does more to make plain rice or beans taste like an actual dish than most people expect from a single ingredient. Genuinely one of the best dollars spent in either budget. $50 has zero room for anything that isn't pure calories per dollar efficient. No snacks, no treats, nothing that exists purely for morale. Every dollar goes to staples, which is the correct call when the budget is this tight. $200 has room for a few genuinely unnecessary items. A bag of hard candy, some coffee or tea, maybe a small chocolate stash. Not a lot, but something. This category doesn't add a single meaningful calorie or nutrient to the pantry, and on a pure efficiency spreadsheet, it's the easiest thing to cut. But real-world stockpile psychology says otherwise. Having one small thing to look forward to in a month of plain staples measurably helps people actually stick with eating from the pantry instead of quitting and buying takeout, which we flagged before as the real threat to any food plan. If money's tight, this is a completely reasonable category to cut entirely. Nobody starves without candy. But if you're already at $200, 5 or 10 of it going toward genuine comfort items is a better use of the last few dollars than a seventh can of the same vegetable. Dried fruit sits in an interesting middle ground worth calling out. It's sweet enough to function as a comfort item, but unlike candy, it also carries real fiber and nutrients. So a small bag of raisins or dried apricots does double duty as both a treat and an actual food contribution. A smarter use of comfort item money than pure sugar, if the budget only stretches to one. $50 almost never has room for dedicated water storage. The assumption is you're relying entirely on the tap, which is fine under normal conditions, but leaves zero buffer if that assumption ever breaks. $200 can fit real water insurance, a couple of food-grade storage containers, or, as we've covered before, a cheap filter and a bottle of unscented bleach that can purify far more water than any amount of storage space alone. This is a category where the $50 version isn't really less water. It's zero backup water plan at all versus a real one. That's a bigger functional gap than most items on this list, even though the dollar cost of closing it is small. A basic filter and a bottle of bleach can run under $20 total and cover an enormous amount of water. If your city water is reliable and this pantry is purely a grocery budget exercise, skipping this at $50 is fine. But the moment reliable water is even slightly in question, this jumps from a nice-to-have to one of the most important items on the entire list, cheap or not. Even inside the $50 budget, there's a genuinely free version of this category worth doing anyway. Rinsed out 2-liter bottles filled from the tap and kept in a closet cost nothing but a little space. And while they're not a purification plan, they're a real few days of backup water that most tight-budget pantries skip purely because nobody thought to fill the empty bottles already sitting in the recycling bin. At $50, quantities are calculated tight, roughly enough for the stated time period, with essentially no cushion if you eat a little more some days or share with someone unexpectedly. At $200, there's real slack built in, 10 to 20% more of everything, so a heavier appetite week or an extra mouth to feed doesn't immediately break the math. This is a quieter difference than more variety or better protein, but it might matter more in practice. A pantry calculated to the exact calorie, with zero buffer, works perfectly on paper and often fails in reality, because real weeks aren't perfectly average. The $200 version can absorb that noise. The $50 version can't. If you're on the tightest possible budget, tight math is the only option, and that's fine. Just know going in that there's no room for error, and plan your portions accordingly rather than getting surprised 3 weeks in. A trick that shrinks the practical downside of tight math without spending more money. Writing out an actual day-by-day meal plan before the month starts, instead of eating freely and hoping the totals work out. A $50 pantry with a real plan behind it outlasts a $200 pantry eaten carelessly, which makes planning arguably the cheapest buffer of all. $50 almost always means everything stays in its original packaging. the bag of rice in its bag, the bulk beans in their sack, because airtight containers, buckets, or mylar simply aren't in the budget once the food itself is paid for. $200 can fit a few food-grade buckets or a handful of mylar bags with oxygen absorbers for the bulk items. Not everything, but the highest value staples get real protection. We've covered this exact mechanism before as the single most common stockpiling mistake there is. The food itself might be identical between the two budgets, but unprotected bulk grain in its original bag is a one-year gamble against moisture, air, and pests, while the same grain in a sealed bucket is a decades-long certainty. Same rice, wildly different actual lifespan. If you can only afford to protect one thing with the extra budget, protect the grain and the beans. They're the bulk of your calories and the most vulnerable to bugs. A few dollars of mylar and an oxygen absorber on just those two items closes most of the real risk, even if the rest of the pantry stays in its original bags. Even without buckets or mylar, the freezer does a version of this job for free. 4 days in the freezer kills any pest eggs already hiding in a bag of flour or rice before they ever get the chance to hatch, which is a zero-cost step the $50 pantry can still take even when the actual storage stays in its original packaging afterward. And here's the one that ties every other category together, because it's not really about any single item. It's about how many of these upgrades stack on top of each other. The $50 pantry is calculated tight, stored loose, seasoned barely, and built for exactly the days it claims to cover, no more. The $200 pantry has buffer in the quantities, protection on the storage, real seasoning, and genuine variety. And every one of those, on its own, seems like a small nice-to-have. Stacked together, they're the difference between a pantry that survives being ignored for a year and one that needs to be used almost immediately or start failing. This is the actual answer to, is the extra $150 worth it? It's not really buying more food. Pound for pound, the calorie gap between the two budgets is smaller than the price gap suggests. What's actually buying is durability, a pantry that forgive a longer timeline, a rougher week, a bit of neglect, instead of one that only works if everything goes exactly to plan. If you're building on a tight budget, that's completely fine. The $50 version genuinely works, and every video on this channel starts from the principle that real prepping beats perfect prepping. But if you do have some extra room, now you know exactly where it does the most good. Seasoning first, then protein and protection, then buffer and comfort. Not just buying more of what you already have. Picture both pantries 6 months in, untouched except for the occasional check. The $50 one is probably fine if nothing unusual happened. Dry, sealed food generally forgives short neglect. The $200 one is fine even if something unusual did happen. A pest got in one bag, a can got dented, the timeline stretched longer than planned. That's the entire value of the extra money, condensed into one picture. So there you have it, 10 places where $50 and $200 genuinely diverge, and the pattern behind almost all of them. The extra money buys durability and variety more than it buys raw calories, because on pure calories per dollar, the cheap staples were already winning. If you're deciding where to spend extra pantry money starting today, the order that gets you the most for the least is simple. Spices first, because they're nearly free and fix the boredom problem. Protein and storage protection next, because those change real outcomes, not just variety. Buffer and comfort items last, because they're genuinely optional even if they're nice to have. If this helped you think about your own pantry budget differently, hit subscribe. New pantry and grocery smart videos almost every day. Real numbers, no judgment either way. And tell me in the comments, if you had an extra $50 for your pantry right now, which category would you spend it on first? Stay stocked, stay smart.